Episode 135, Allan Chapman, the Victorians and the Holy Land. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I chat with Allan Chapman, who teaches History of Science at Oxford University and has written extensively on history and science, including the relationship between the two. He is a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and a founder member of the Society for the History of Astronomy. He is the author of several well-received books, including the one we will be discussing in this episode. I loved reading this book. I found myself fascinated by the characters that Allan references and the various events that he talks about. If you have any interest in the history of Christianity, then I recommend this book as an enjoyable read. As always, see the show notes for links to the book and topics that are referenced in the book. There are items in the links that we do not specifically cover in this conversation, so please do check them out for a taste of what the book covers. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is going to be a bit of a special episode, slightly different from what we normally do. It is an interview. It's an interview with a very special guest, one that I am delighted to host here on Still Unbelievable, and one whose book I am very pleased to have read. The reason why it's slightly different is it's history rather than specifically science or religion, and I think we'll all benefit from a little bit of that. My guest today is Dr. Allan Chapman. He's written a book called Victorians and the Holy Land. It's an investigation and an exploration of the activities of the Victorians in the Holy Land, opening it up to investigation both by tourists and by intellectuals. I really enjoyed the book. It was fascinating. I learnt from it. It was really interesting to read it. So, Dr. Allan Chapman, you are, I believe, a professor, a teacher at Oxford University, and I can tell from And I can tell from your bio that you've written multiple books, including books on the relationship between science and religion, but not exclusive to that, mostly in the historical context. So you have a long list of books, which I'm sure my readers will be interested in. But today we're talking specifically about the Victorians and the Holy Land. Welcome to Still Unbelievable, Dr. Chapman. I think that where I'd like to start with this, because there's so much that I enjoyed and I appreciated about the book, is to set the scene around what inspired the book, what prompted you to want to write this book, what story are you trying to tell and who are you trying to tell it to?
Basically speaking, I've been interested in this subject since I was a boy. I'm really a historian of science, specializing in the history of medicine and astronomy. So I'm not claiming to be possessed by original interest, but I've been reading books on this subject from being a small boy going to the library, borrowing from the local library. It captured my attention, and I thought I should do a book on it. There's an old, long-standing interest, and it's also, as I always like to do, it's full of interesting characters and interesting incidents.
It is, and I was genuinely fascinated by it. And I think one little tidbit for the British audience is the name Thomas Cook, because anybody who's British will know that name from boards and shops on their high street, because although it's less popular today, certainly in recent decades, it's been a name that's been associated with the package travel industry. And that name crops up about midway through your book. And it was really fascinating to read that part of the book.
Yeah.
I guess before we get into the detail, who do you want to read the book? Who is the book aimed at? What's your audience?
The general reader, historians, and theologians.
And as someone who's only vaguely interested,
historians.
And as somebody, I'll be honest, and I did mention this briefly before we hit record, is I don't have much of a history of reading history books. It's not something that I've done habitually, but I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed this hearing about all these characters from years gone by. And I think what for me was most fascinating was in the context of the stories of these characters, they're doing it without any of the modern advances that we have today. They didn't have mobile phones, so they could ring home. it was letters which would often get put on a train and then a steamship and then another train. Communication back home, either to their families or to their sponsors, could take months.
But then you don't forget you had the crucial thing by this time, the electric telegraph. And then the electric telegraph went to America in 1866. And so you could literally do something in London or wherever and learn about it for the evening's papers in New York.
Okay, so yep, I did manage to omit that. So was that also available then in the area of the world that you're talking about, in North Africa and the area around Israel and the Promised Land?
I think the reason is it was the most accessible.
Right.
The Nile is the big river. No matter where you'd be going on the Nile, you found statues, magnificent structures, temples, pyramids, and the stories, of course, in Exodus that the children of Israel had been kept there as slaves, and that had been what their position had turned into as slaves, and it's just so fascinating. But we knew far, far more about the Egypt than we knew about Assyria and Babylonian. But only in the 19th century did Assyria and Babylonian enter the world's consciousness as a real place.
Yes, and I really loved the Egypt parts. The title of the book promises the Holy Land, but you spend an awful lot of time in the book talking about Egypt as well. Now, that obviously makes a lot of
part of the Holy Land, because a good bit of the Bible story takes place in Egypt.
Yes, absolutely right. You can't understand the Holy Land context without actually understanding the history of the story of Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt and all that. So the two parts of the world are not just geographically close together, but historically intertwined together, and that really comes across in the book.
Yeah. And bear in mind too that really Palestine didn't have much of an impact on the ancient world. Herodotus, for instance, in his accounts of travels in the Middle East, in the ancient Greek times, never mentions Palestina, or only just a passing remark of Palestina, who is conceived as a dependent on the kings of Syria.
Right. So was Syria an impressive kingdom at the time that you're writing about? Was it a kingdom with power and clout?
It was at the time when Herodotus was there in the 3rd century.
Right. So it had a historical impact on that area of the world.
Oh yes, oh yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about the statues along the Nile in Egypt, and there's some impressive photos in your book and descriptions of these places. We're not talking just about the pyramids. There are other parts of the Nile further south which have also got these impressive statues, and I think personally I found those more impressive than the pyramids personally, in terms of the majesty that they invoked. So these kinds of things, are they all the way down the Nile? Is there evidence of this kind of thing further down?
What the Bible is concerned with is around the Nile, around the pyramids. I mean, we have Dendera right up into the top of Egypt. There are lots of things there, but there's no evidence that the Jews and the children of Israel ever had anything to do with that place.
Right.
I mean, Egypt's a big country, but a couple of 1,000 miles on the twisting banks of the Nile. But the Jews were at the bottom end, as it were, which we would call the Nile Delta.
Right.
And the area around what would become the city of Cairo.
Okay. So you're saying that there was a Jewish habitation there?
What?
Was there a Jewish habitation there?
According to Jewish accounts, yes.
There was, right.
In the book of Exodus.
Sorry, what was that about the Exodus?
They're mentioned in the book of Exodus.
There was no Exodus.
Joseph, who becomes the vizier pharaoh, and effectively runs the country, was a Jew, brilliant, clever, persuasive, and he was invited to bring his own people over from Palestine, which was suffering, which seemed some poverty and starvation at the time, and they hit the big time in Egypt. And it's also by legend that the 7 pyramids were equivalent to the 7 years of plague.
Oh, right.
So that there's initially the granaries, the storehouses of Pharaoh, and each one according to a plague.
Right, you do a very good job of disseminating that myth about the pyramids being grain houses. I remember as a young child being told when I was a young boy at missionary school, as in a school for children of missionaries, that the pyramids were one of the reasons why the pyramids were built could have been the grain houses and the storehouses. So we were teaching children that as recently as 50 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Good Lord. Well, I've been in them. And certainly so much stone you couldn't store anything.
Yes. We know that now.
But hollow.
Yes.
It
was nice to read that, and it was nice to read your description of the pyramids and your experience of being inside the pyramids. It was really quite fascinating. We obviously know so much more about the pyramids now, but for those early Victorian explorers who saw those pyramids for the very first time, that they must have been quite mesmerizing, quite awe-inspiring, because there was nothing in Europe that matched that.
But nonetheless, they were part of European history. Any Christian parts of Europe would be familiar with the pyramids, from purely literary sources.
Right.
So they wouldn't have been shock horror when you saw them.
Right. Because they knew they existed, they just hadn't seen them yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was when travel such as steamships and things of this sort of photography came along, that it was then possible to see the pyramids and realize how fascinating they were.
Yeah, yes. So they must have been. And I know a few people who've seen the pyramids in recent years, and they always say they are quite inspiring, the way they dominate the landscape.
Yes, they are. And they're amazing things. Napoleon Bonaparte, when he invaded Egypt, slept in the Great Pyramid and left it rather frightened.
Right.
I think he thought that might be spookies or things of this sort to come and get him.
Could this be part of the stories of the curses that are sometimes associated with some of these places?
Yeah. Associated with the sources and curses and so on. Yeah.
So
the curses of the pharaohs, I think, had far more to do with journalism than it ever had with recording history.
Oh, I see. Right, because I was about to ask, are those curses anything to do with dissuading people from looting them, or is it just a much more modern interpretation?
No, I mean, yes, we have that modern interpretation, which is accepted academically, but there are a large number of people out there who are just simply given over to superstitions and so on. Yeah. I mean, I've met people who believe these things.
Right. So would that affect their decisions on entering pyramids?
Oh, yes.
Wow.
I mean, people out there who really believe that there's some curse attack. And of course, when Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun and his patient died suddenly of an insect bite. Mm-hmm. Oh, the press went mad. This is the curse of Pharaoh.
Right.
And that's 1923.
Golly. Okay, so yes, only just over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about the not very much evidence about the Israelite, the biblical story of the Israelites, the Israelites living in Egypt, leading up to the Exodus. So do we have any theories as to how the Exodus story came about?
We have the Jewish account of it,
Right.
but that's pretty much it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to unpick what might have been the source, the original source of that story. Okay.
When you have a document like the Bible, which is covering itself several thousand years of history, and it's meant to tailor in to show that the Jews are the winners at every stage, and so it's easy to get misled by these things.
Right. And it's interesting you say that, because every story where someone comes out the hero, they always have a low point. And it seems that the slavery in Egypt seems to be the literary low point from which they triumph.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. They went into Egypt as Joseph's family and lineage and so on. But then when Joseph dies, and the book of Exodus, tells us about his death, and Genesis, then what happens? They enslave them. But I do wonder what slavery means. I don't think it's the sort of thing that you had in the American South in the 19th century. Right. Slavery simply means you do your job or you don't eat.
Okay. Well, because the modern world imagines that the alleged Jewish slavery under the Egyptians would have been hard labor under a whip, and you're saying that's probably not the case.
No more so than any Egyptians had the same things.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, the thing is, you don't shift those gigantic blocks of stone by saying, would you please move that big stone for me, please? You get your whip out.
Yeah. Yes, you need.
Was happening in the 19th century when English travellers found that life was cheap, and they flogged and beat people, including their own time. We have to bear in mind that modern standards of human rights and kindness and so on are very, very, very recent indeed.
Of course, yes, that's right. And those pyramids probably took many decades, even hundreds of years to build, I imagine.
Oh yes, but the thing is, the gigantic one was the Cheops.
Right.
And allegedly it was built during his lifetime. So, and the granite was not local. The granite came from further up the river. And so you're dealing with gigantic quarrying, the enormous business of taking large, rough lumps of stone, then figuring and shaping them to precisely fit in individual parts of the pyramid. It's an amazing thing, and shows that the power of organization was there.
I think the thing that amazes me most about the pyramids is when you look at the modern day cross sections of the way they look, and somebody on a bit of ink and parchment must have designed how the internals of this was going to look, and then visualize how they were going to move the stone in order to build this internal visualization. And I think for me, the internal architecture of these things and how practically they could have done it without modern computers, without modern aided design, without mechanical assistance is quite amazing.
It is amazing. And Piazzi Smith, of course, in the 19th century, who thought that the pyramids were holding places of divine secrets. He was Astronomer Royal for Scotland. Nonetheless, these ideas sound a bit crazy to us today, but the surveying of them, the construction, and the precision with which the stones lay with each other was phenomenal. It really was.
So moving on from the pyramids, because the pyramids, and again, you draw this out in your book, the pyramids gave a real spark of intellectual curiosity. How did these things happen? What other things in the area, in the region, can we find that are interesting? It sparked off archaeology. What's the relationship then between the archaeological digs in Egypt and then the archaeological digs in Palestine and Israel?
And they were all to dig up. The man, of course, who really did this in a serious way in the 19th century, in the 19th and 20th century, was Flinders Petrie, Sir Flinders Petrie, who pioneered archaeology in a serious sense. And he dug both in Egypt and in Palestine, and used the same techniques. And he died in 1948, something like that, at a great age.
Right.
Yeah.
There must have been a difference in technique, because in Egypt, and again, you've got photos of this in your book, when they first discovered some of these artifacts, like the Sphinx, for example, in Egypt, that was half buried in sand. So there was a massive job to uncover all that and dig all the sand away. And that's done with big mechanical excavators. But then when you get to Israel and Palestine and all that, you're dealing with much smaller artifacts, much different types of materials. So they must have refined their methodologies and their technologies in order to get physically smaller artifacts.
But bearing in mind, of course, they had a totally different religion, the Jews.
Right.
And that was not about enshrining and deifying a dead man. It was about God. It was not about a pharaoh.
Right. Okay, so what was the Jewish attitude then to these sacred places at that time? What was the Jewish attitude towards their holy sites?
I'm not sure of that. They weren't necessarily in the Holy Land either. The Jews were dispersed.
Of course they
at
had.
this time. And it was only really in the 19th and 20th century that you start getting them coming together again as a nation. And of course, after 1945, is it, when they're finally given the land of Israel to go to their homeland, which of course causes all the trouble we still have today.
Yes, sadly, that's very true. And that in the mid to late 1800s, the land of Israel is not the land of Israel that we recognise today.
No.
So the people that are living
there, but they were minorities.
Right. So all the sites that we call the Holy Land sites today, the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem, the crucifixion location at Calvary, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, all those places, were they revered at all in the 1800s by anybody?
Yes. Yeah, very much so, because there was, to some degree, I mean, how did you know that a certain street in Jerusalem was one down which Jesus carried the cross?
Right.
Well, basically, it's tradition and legend. But I see no reason why one should doubt that. Because if you were being sent from the old temple to Calvary, you'd more or less go down that street. And it's still there to this day.
Wow, that's quite fascinating to think about. Those streets that have survived two millennia of variations in history. So at the time when the Victorians were arriving here to explore all these sites, who was living on the land and who did the Victorians have to negotiate with?
Yes, various sheikhs and other individuals. Bearing in mind that there was no full-scale local occupation there, because it was basically the Ottoman Empire that ruled it. I mean, right through this entire later period, so to 1922, with the abolition of the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey, because Palestine was just part of that empire. And had just grown up over the years as the but with the growth of Islam after, well, about 600 AD, and then gradually taking all before it. And of course, what you had with the Holy Land sheikhs and so on, they'd adopted what they liked from the New World, aspects of medicine,
right,
things of this sort. So they weren't necessarily against it, but what it was really irrelevant to that wider culture. It wasn't until the abolition of that empire in 1922 that things took on the form they are today. And it was so that the Jews had a right to their homeland.
Mm.
And of course, they still have that today. Look at Netanyahu. It's the idea of the homeland of the Jews.
Mm.
And we kick out anybody who they don't want to be there. And there's a lot of kicking out happened in the ancient world. I mean, when you look at the wars of King David, why David is such an important figure in Jewish history, he basically put to the sword or kicked out anybody who didn't share his views.
Yes, that's right. So when the Victorians were exploring this new land, or rather, it wasn't a new land; it was a new to them. When they were exploring this land, the land that we now call Israel and Palestine, how did the local tribes receive them? Were they well received by the Ottoman tribes?
Depending on what you had in your pocket.
Isn't that always the way?
And the thing is that the West had, it had money, it had technology, it had a whole new raft of learning that part of the world has never developed. I mean, the train, for instance, or the steamboat, nothing remotely like it in the ancient world. Boats on the River Nile had been driven by sail and by oars from the days of, well, long before Christ. And they're still there today. I've been on one and shot part of a program on one on for TV. But once you started to have the big ships like you have now, the big tour liners, with their steamboats and their paddles and so on, there was nothing remotely like it to the contemporaries. Likewise, trains were getting there. Railways were already in that advanced state of technology by the time that the Victorians hit the Holy Land.
So the indigenous Ottomans, those who were living there at the time, must have seen these visitors with this fancy technology and pockets full of money, and used every kind of scam they possibly could in order to exchange to get hold of the money.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, there was more money out there than they could ever make themselves.
Right.
You come across references to Belzonians on the early explorer about the way in which the native Egyptians or the native locals were treated by their masters. And it was barbaric. And the idea if life was cheap and you flog them to death and they got another one. And so, you got your working staff in the same way that you get your coal in a large quantity and use it, burn it, and then throw it away. But of course, it was a whole new set of Western values, Western money, Western speed, travel, all of that.
It must have been quite a sight if you were...
A totally new kind of world.
Yes, it must be. I'm just imagining what it must be like if you've never seen a steamship before in your life. And there you are, and you see this thing turn up.
That's it. I mean, you even have certain aspects of it today. For instance, I remember the thing I filmed a while ago in Egypt. And they had me to ride this lovely little white donkey, a beautiful little donkey up the road. And I got off the donkey, and then I and other members of the film crew started to give the donkey sugar lumps. And the owners of the donkey who bought him couldn't understand why on earth you were treating a donkey like that. They were just donkeys, treating animals with affection. It was novel fun.
Yes, I imagine. So it really gives an indication of the difference in attitudes between the two cultures.
Absolutely. I too used to know, probably did, a senior college porter of mine in college, and he'd been a sergeant major in the army, and he said that he once saw a group of peasants flogging and whipping a donkey for some reason. And he said what he did, he drew his revolver, fired it in the air to get their attention. He said he'd shoot them if they didn't teach their donkey more kindly. Now that idea of a British sergeant doing that, is a big, big difference in approach.
Fascinating. What a great story. So by the time, I can't remember what the date was, but by the time Thomas Cook, who we've already mentioned, arrived in the Promised Land then and started creating the tours that he did, what was his motivation for creating these tours? Was it just to make money from a holiday business?
It was never about money.
It was never about money.
He was a first-rate businessman. And if you could get money for something, he'd get it. Right. But that money would go not to his luxurious lifestyle, which he never lived, but to spreading knowledge, spreading the Christian gospel.
Right.
And that's what it was before. I mean, he starts off as a young entrepreneur in Britain. He's a minister, an itinerant minister. And he suddenly finds that there's a new railway being laid between Loughborough and somewhere else in the English Midlands. And he was staunch, he told that. He believed that the demon drink would get you. And he put on a cheap day return for people to go and listen to the speakers. This is about 1844, a long time ago. And he found it made a lot of money. And there were more wanting. And he was very good at making contacts, houses and boarding houses. He took large numbers of people to the Great Exhibition in 1851 and then started taking them abroad. He starts to find that there's demand for people who want to travel, and the railways have made it possible for them to travel. And whether it's just a day out to Loughborough in the Midlands, or whether it's to Carnac, depends on the technology. Because what was happening at that time too was in Egypt, the big riverboats were coming along, big steamers, which were effectively floating hotels. And he was very good at cashing in these, not cashing it in a crude sense, but cashing in on a sense that there's opportunity here, in his view, to spread the gospel and stop people drinking.
Right.
And when he saw the Jordan, for instance, he did something which is amazing. First time I've seen the Jordan, he walked into the river, which allegedly the place where Jesus had done his baptizing, and walked straight in and dipped his own head in the water, top hat and all. Came out wringing wet through because he had done the same thing that Jesus had done.
Wow. Oh, quite something. Hopefully he dried off quickly. But it's quite a novel idea in today's world that somebody would make lots of money from an enterprise like that and then immediately turn that money around and drive it straight into the local community.
And the thing is, you see, too, he was taking people who normally couldn't travel. You know, you had, let's say, a comfortably off shopkeeper or somebody like that. Yes, very nice. It might be the pillar of their local society. Yeah, and pillar of their local church. But they were nothing in the eyes of the wealthy. He was able to start taking these people to the Holy Land. And so you find a lot of comments, very angry ones from some of the better off. You go and travel to Italy or to Palestine or somewhere, and you suddenly find shopkeepers and people like that. They should be back at home doing the work, leaving these places for the better off other cultures to sin. But what he was doing, he was breaking down social barriers as well.
Yes, it was, because it gave people the experience of an alternative culture, of a different culture, people who lived differently, had different daily priorities.
An actual Democrat. He believed in things being for everybody. And money was there to improve the world.
What a novel idea.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there are lessons there in his life that we could definitely learn from today and maybe rethink some attitudes.
Okay.
There was something else that you said in your book. I'm changing line a little bit here, but there was a little thing you said in your book which really struck me, and that is when talking about dynasties and the years of reign of certain dynasties, and you make reference to rounding up dynasties, you know, compressing dynasties into a representation of a single individual, but it actually means several generations. Is this a common practice at that time to represent multiple generations with a single individual?
No, because what they didn't use was a 0 point of reckoning. And so there was such a thing happened 10 years after the death of King so-and-so.
Right.
Or 8 years after, because you have to do all your calculation. But what you started to find, of course, later on, you had your AC and BC dating. And that actually then gave you absolute. Those techniques would then be used by the archaeologists and the philologists of the 19th century to actually then make sense of what they were finding. And so that's what makes it easier for many, many people. And when, you know, you get somebody like Layard going to Assyria and finding the winged lions of Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this was absolutely breathtaking. When they brought some of the winged lions back to England, the crowds, it was said, between London Docks and the British Museum was so dense you could hardly get by.
So were these explorers then treated like celebrities at the time? Were they the modern day celebrities?
They did indeed. They were great intellect, treated a bit like spacemen might be treated today.
Right, because they would go on a trip and then.
And at that time, you've been in Nineveh and the lands of the pharaohs.
Yeah, because these explorers would disappear and come back 2 or 3 years later, wouldn't they? And then do a speaking circuit of what they did.
And when you bear in mind getting a winged lion of Babylon back to England, it needed you first of all to get it onto a raft, float it all the way down the Tigris River, through the Gulf of the river, probably lodge it onto a ship there, take it all the way around Africa, up Africa, and finally arriving in London. That was the only way you could do it before 1870 odd, when you actually had the building of the Suez Canal,
Right.
which vastly sped up everything. But the amount of hard work, even for an English labourer, although nobody fronted the English labourer with a cane. I mean, we tended to work the other way around. And we were trying to actually get people to do more work. We didn't whip them. We offered them an extra £6 a week.
Right. Yes. Was there a huge thirst for these kinds of artifacts? Were there a lot of people back home in England wanting to see and touch these artifacts?
Heart of London. When the Great Exhibition was opened in London in 1851, they built a gallery of an Assyrian gallery. It did not contain necessarily an original. These were safe in the British Library or the British Museum, but they were authentic models, so people could go and gasp at them.
Right.
And to think of the idea that, the captive children of Israel in the Holy Land, when taken away by Hezekiah, could actually see these things. Then you could touch something. Now, I mean, I know in Oxford, in a college where there's such an artifact, it's a wall decoration, a carved wall decoration, about 3 or 4 feet square, and it's on the wall, and it's the oldest thing in the college at 2000 BC. And, it is amazing to look at them. And it was about Ashurbanipal, and he's holding his arm up, Ashurbanipal, like this.
Mm-hmm.
And there are things on his wrist here. And these were, of course, designations of status in the Assyrian army. And when I'm showing them to people, I always said they were Ashurbanipal's wristwatch. They look just like wristwatches.
Yeah, fantastic. I must say, I do feel a little sad that these treasures from these other lands were all hoarded to one nation for people to enjoy, and the people who originally built them and the people who grew up with them lose the pleasure of being able to see them in their original habitat.
Yes. I mean, if you do that, by the time of Cook, these were just becoming available, being discovered by Layard and other geologists and so on. I mean, the Assyria was discovered in its non-literary sense by Austin Henry Layard and a French doctor who were traveling to Australia, but decided to go overland and see some adventures overland rather than just a ship over Earth. And what they started to find is as they made these journeys, they found great mounds in the plain, in this barren plain. And lo and behold, if you hired, let's say, 50 labourers, the labour was cheap, and they started to dig through these things, suddenly the winged lions of Troy would appear, and all sorts of other things. And it was just so amazing that within about 20 years, you went from ignorance to these things, or just biblical references to them, to actually finding scores and scores of real live artifacts, which ended up in Paris, in Berlin, in New York, and of course in London.
And I can only imagine what it must have been like for some of these people digging up these ancient statues, which could have been buried under dirt or sand or whatever for hundreds of years. And they're the first people to see them for a very long time. It must have been quite an experience.
It was tremendous, you find this out. But where it did come from is that the labourers would go away sometimes and not come back. This was, of course, a Muslim country at that time. And there was a great horror of the worship of idols. And the Muslims were of the view that these were the ancient gods of the pagans coming back to life. And you couldn't do that. And it took a lot of negotiating with tribal leaders and so on before you could continue a dig.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because yes, if you're trying to excavate something and you have a local culture who either reveres or fears the thing that you're trying to dig up and extract, you've got more than just a cultural conflict going on there. You've got something that's deeply spiritual that you've got to resolve.
Oh, they're all serious spiritual. Our modern idea of, just physical objects, that's really a post-17th century idea. To them, everything has some kind of spiritual value. Either pagan gods or Christian gods or Jewish or whatever.
Wow, it's something that we can't comprehend today because there's probably nothing left for us to discover like that.
Yeah.
And
never say that. You never know.
The famous last words. But we know so much more about these old religions. The superstitions there must have been much more visceral than they would be today.
The idea that there were ancient pagan gods, that these got buried in the sand, and now these chaps are coming along revealing them. That was clearly an indication that terror was going to hit on the land, as the Prophet Muhammad would protect you and would actually tell all those who deal with the wicked, horrible practice of bringing the dead gods back to life. And to them it would have been the bringing of the dead gods back to life. It wasn't just simply a piece of statuary.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'm really intrigued by in your book is you tell this story about digging up statues, etc. And then at some point the motivation changes and people are now looking at ancient cities and trying to tell the story of the ancient city, and they're now what they're digging up is not old statues and long deceased gods, it's human habitation and city walls and things like that. So they're digging up things which are very different, and they're not digging up something to carry home to put on display. They're digging up something so they can try to tell the story of the place that they're digging. When did that shift change?
Yeah. In some of those countries today, I wouldn't like to say. I wouldn't like to say what might happen if we dug certain things up in Syria or some Muslim countries. I don't think it would affect the Jews.
Right.
A sophisticated culture. I don't think it would affect, obviously, the Christians. But there's some other sectarian faiths that I'm sure still have these ideas lurking in the back of their collective memory.
Right. Okay. But in terms of the Victorian explorers, though, who were excavating these lands, when did their motivation change to finding out the history?
Well, because they would do the same all the way along.
Okay.
But I think when you had with like Flinders Petrie, where you actually use the objects, no matter how insignificant, a tiny pot or a handle or something like that, all of it would indicate to you where you were actually going historically. And it changes. And then the things that we had in the West was not actually a superstition. It would be the market value. Now, Hans Sloane in London, he John Sloane, not Sloane. He was a great collector, a medical man and so on. And he has in the basement of his house, still there because they can't remove it.
Right.
And built across it a great sarcophagus of one of the pharaohs. And I've seen it. And he had to knock part of the house down really to get it into his private museum.
Wow.
Yes, John Sloane.
That must be quite something to have in your house.
Oh, yeah. A very, very, very wealthy man and bought things like that.
Must have been. Was the income from some of these artifacts then used to fund further exploration?
I mean, Henry Salt, who was the British commissioner in Egypt in the early 19th century, and the pensioner Giovanni Belzoni, they certainly sold them on, and they pocketed the money usually to buy more artifacts.
Right.
Because there was an enormous market for them.
So lots of trading going on.
Oh, yes, enormous. And it was so simple. You just go out there with a shovel and find something of value.
Right, I'm sure. Anyone familiar with the Old Testament will know about the battles of the judges, specifically Joshua, but there are obviously others. So we've got cities like Ai, Nineveh, which we've already mentioned, and others which are destroyed in various miraculous events. Was there enthusiasm to locate these old cities and to find them?
Yeah. I mean, look at the news tonight. Gaza.
Yeah.
That was one of them. One of them. And so, we've had things on that strip which would have been there for at least from the time of Abraham, and of a vast age, ditto to the trading cities of the north. I mean, this desire to find these places was very, very widespread. Oh, yeah. But the big cities, many of them still have the same names to this day. Yeah.
Right. And what was the motivation in finding these cities? Was it literally also to find artifacts and say, here is some of the wall from the city of Ai that got knocked down? Or were people trying to achieve that?
Yeah, that's it. We're trying to put them into context.
Right. Okay. But then if you've brought this piece of ancient pottery and called it a brick, and you've brought it halfway across the world, how do you actually know if this ancient brick is really from the city that you say it is?
Basically speaking, from context, where it was found, the fact that it looked like from decoration of the right period of Jericho, but it was, well, to some degree, it missed. But it was this great desire to find these things. And of course, the ruins of things like Jericho.
Yes, I meant because everybody's familiar with the story of Jericho. Certainly anybody who's read the Old Testament, which presumably most of the people who were doing this exploration at the time. So what was the impact of these explorations for the average Victorian sitting in the pews back in England? Did it?
Very great indeed. Very great indeed. Depending on their interest. Because you don't just simply have going there. You also now you can buy photographs of them. You can also, as I say in the book too, even the stories are based upon them. The secular stories. And then hymns. So many of the hymns in the Bible are actually rooted in Old Testament and New Testament events. When you take the hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, which is about the Jehovah leading the Jews out of Palestine, out of Egypt. And then, of course, the idea of crossing the Nile, crossing the Jordan, and all that to be sung. And you might have asked them, what was this fiery, cloudy pillar? And things of this sort.
Must have been, yes. And bringing photos back must have been quite something, because again, your book covers the period where photography was becoming portable. It was a new technology, and advances were being made continuously, and people were now able to carry a camera and a dark room,
yes,
and transport it and take a photo and develop it there and then and bring back photos of these places.
You've got that, yeah. So you have also theatre. You have various things to bring this to life. Mm-hmm. And it just shows how deeply embedded the Victorian culture this was.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. So going back again to the history then of the people of modern day Israel, their story goes back to Egypt, which is where you place a lot of the book. What about the journey from Egypt to ancient Israel? That journey that's told in the Exodus and that period.
We have the official story from the Bible, where they're being kicked out by Pharaoh for the great plagues and so on. One wonders how far they had just got on the nerves of the ancient Egyptians, and they were more or less said, go. I mean, you do wonder whether there was a lot of reluctance to stay there. Because it was a much easier world. You just get on and look for somewhere for your own, instead of having the Egyptians feeding you. Because don't forget, of course, although the Egyptians were making the mud bricks and so on, they had to keep the Jews. And that, I mean, financially. So let them go off and do what they want, and you keep your own money. You keep your own bricks.
Yeah. So in reality, what would that journey have been like to travel from Egypt to modern day Israel today? What would that journey have been like for people to make that journey?
It would have been known through shepherds, through travellers, merchants, cross the Red Sea, get into the Holy Land Basin, cross it, go over to the far distance up the great Gulf, which is the basis of the Jordan, the Red Sea, and up you go there. That's a well-known route.
So you're saying basically traders and merchants would have been traveling that route for decades prior anyway, so it was a known road.
I mean, I think the idea that it was so modern that I think we forget how ancient it was. And like I say, the area they're wandering in was, roughly speaking, about the size of South Wales. Now, you get the impression from the Bible that they were wandering for, infinite distances.
Yeah.
No, you look at the area where they were traveling, not much bigger than South Wales. And you keep walking around it.
Yeah, it's a few days walk, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about the geography of that area, and you mentioned it as well, it's the Bible talks about a desert. And yes, there are some desert areas, but it's not all desert, is it?
Not at all. I mean, how did you keep your sheep and your cattle if it was all desert?
Yeah.
They'll die. And, there is a lot of grass out there, especially around the edges of the Sinai Peninsula. But the suspicion is that they followed the Sinai Peninsula to the sea and around there. They were going through areas of grass, and sometimes they would stay in the place for a long time, and they didn't want to move. Other times they would have to be moved around. But the idea that they were there in sand, no,
it doesn't work, really, does it?
You couldn't get bread out of sand.
No. And get
depends on the local geology, because it's a lot of limestone, and that tends to have a lot of water trapped in the structure of the limestone. and the right breaks at the right places in the limestone will actually produce a trickle of water. I came across one reference some years ago to a British squadron in that part of area, the sort of Palestinian area around Sinai, and a sergeant took a hammer and bashed the side of a rock, and out spurted water.
Right.
Well, a totally barren landscape.
That's quite a fascinating story, that, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
To recap then about your book, Dr. Allan, fascinating book. I genuinely recommend it to my listeners, the Victorians and how they opened up the Holy Land. Really interesting, lots of characters in that book, and you spend a lot of time in Egypt, which is a really fascinating place, some of the history there, and you tell a bit of the story of the Israelites and their journey, and you managed to paint a really good picture, certainly for me anyway, of how exploration slowly evolved in that area, and how interest back home and in exploring and then arrival of the camera. It's a really, really fascinating story. So listeners, if this kind of thing is at all of interest to you, genuinely, I recommend this book. I really enjoyed reading this book. It's under three.
I certainly enjoyed writing it. Certainly, because I am a historian, but I'm also a natural storyteller. When I come from a family that's sitting around the fireplace of an evening and telling tales as part of the life. So stories to me are in the blood.
Excellent. And there's so much rich material there from. So thank you so much for writing that. The link in the show notes. Yes, link will be in the show notes, listeners. There was just one more thing that I wanted to mention to you, and it's almost an obscure reference you make in the book, but it intrigued me because I spent many of my formative years growing up in Central Africa. And you mentioned this city or land of Punt in the book, and you hypothesize about it may have been a trading port or a place of trade that was south from Egypt, etc. And you mentioned the wonderful place of the Great Zimbabwe, right down in Central Africa, a place that I have visited, and I love it. I really did enjoy my visit to the Great Zimbabwe.
Thought in many circles the land of Punt was Great Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Oh, that is now settled, is it? You think that is the case?
Well, I mean, a possibility, yes.
Because that in itself must have been a tremendous journey from Egypt all the way down through half of Africa down. And the thing I wanted to mention about the Great Zimbabwe is there's a hillside right next door to it, and you climb that hill and you look over what would have been the residences of the Great Zimbabwe, and you get a real image of how huge this civilization must have been, and the great activity that must have been there. It's fantastic.
I entirely agree with you, Matthew.
So I loved reading about that. I never thought that I would pick up a book about the Holy Land and read about the Great Zimbabwe in it. It was wonderful. So thank you from me for that little treasure, because it was great for me to do that.
Thanks also to my wife Rachel for pressing the right buttons to make these recordings. I'm a computer dinosaur.
We can't all be great at everything, sir.
Oh yeah.
So what's left for me is there's one question that I like to ask my guests before I say goodbye to them, and that is, do they have a favorite Bible character, and who is it?
Well, obviously Jesus.
It's Jesus.
Yes, there's about that. And going into the Old Testament, well, there's a lot of them. David and Esau.
There's a lot of great characters in the Old Testament, aren't there?
There are tons and tons and tons of them.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Allan. Thank you again. Thank you again for the book. Genuinely enjoyed your book. Genuinely recommend it to my listeners. And until next time, everybody, be reasonable.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allan. I really enjoyed the chat. Thank you for your time again. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.